Okay, this is my first video I'm making for Philosophy 103, Critical Thinking. What I'm going to do is go over some of the exercises from, Chapter 8 we'll start with, and I'm going to talk about the answers. Now, I know 8.1 we've already covered, and this will be review for a lot of you, but if you're having trouble with fallacies and how to identify them, this will be useful, and otherwise it'll be useful for me just to get some practice. Now, the software I'm using, the maximum length of these videos is 15 minutes, so I'm going to try to keep them short. If you have questions on the videos, there are discussion forums you can use to post questions. For this video, you'd post them in the exercise, or the discussion forum for exercise 8.1. Okay, so let's get started. For this exercise, you're asked to do numbers 1 through 10. Most of you have submitted this already, so I'm just going to go through the answers. And again, I know we did these in class one day, so if you were there and you got a pretty good handle on this one, you can probably skip this video, but otherwise it can be helpful. All right, number 1. Most Americans own their own homes. How do I know? Everyone I know owns their own home. Now, this fallacy, and I have here in bold, remember the key question to ask is what's wrong with this reasoning? So don't worry too much about the names of the fallacies at first. Just try to figure out what goes wrong. And most of the fallacies have names that will help you identify them once you figure out what's gone wrong. So here you can see what goes wrong pretty easily, I hope. It starts from a premise about most Americans, the conclusion that most Americans own their own homes. And the reason for that conclusion is everyone I know owns their own home. Now, the problem with that reasoning is it draws a broad generalization from a small, probably unrepresentative sample, right? So just because everyone I know owns their own home doesn't mean everyone in America owns their own home. So notice this keyword generalization, right? That's when you apply something to everybody, you generalize. And so this fallacy is called hasty generalization, right? To be hasty is to do something quickly. And so the idea here is you make a conclusion about everyone, which is just another word for generalize, too fast, which is another word for hasty. So hasty generalization is when you generalize to a whole group from a small sample. All right, so the answer to number 1 is hasty generalization. Number 2, taking drugs can impair your thinking. Joe is on drugs because he takes aspirin every day, and aspirin is a drug. So Joe probably has impaired thinking. So what's wrong with this reasoning? You can see that the term drugs is being used in at least 2 different ways, right? So here in the first sentence, taking drugs can impair your thinking. So the word drugs is being used to mean thought, or let's call it mind impairing substances, right? But then the second sentence, he's on drugs because he takes aspirin every day, and aspirin is a drug. There, the word drugs, and I'll call this drugs too, is just being used to include like basically all medicines, right? Now, the issue here, the problem here is that not all medicines are mind-impairing substances. So in effect, the word drugs is being used in 2 different senses in this argument, and that has 2 different meanings. So in one sense, it means mind-impairing substances or mind-altering substances. In another sense, it just refers to medicines. And since aspirin is not mind-altering, at least for most people, the two are not the same. The 2 meanings of drug here is not the same. So the fallacy here is called equivocation. And equivocation is when you use the same term with different meanings without making it clear that you're doing so, right? So the term that's being used with different meanings in this number 2 is drug or drugs. The first meaning means mind-altering. The second meaning is just any medicine or pharmaceutical. And because they don't have the same meaning, or because the word drug doesn't have the same meaning, you get a weird conclusion. All right. So equivocation is when you use the same term with different meanings within the argument without making it clear that's what you're doing. So when you look at number 3, people who are high are usually not at their sharpest. If you're not at your sharpest, you shouldn't be climbing mountains. When people climb mountains, they get to a very high altitude. If you're at a high altitude, then by definition you are high, so nobody should climb mountains. Now, hopefully you can see after we just talked about 2 that a very similar thing is going on in number 3. This time, though, the word high is being used ambiguously or with different meanings, right? So high in the first sense means something like mind altered, right? High in the second sense means at a great altitude. And again, they clearly are using the word high with different meanings, but pretending as if it means the same thing in both cases, which is what leads to the weird conclusion. And that's why, again, this one is the fallacy of equivocation. All right. So, number 4, driver to officer. You should let me go without a ticket because my pet cockroach just died and he was my best friend and I am devastated. All right. So, this is clearly an appeal to some emotion. In this case, because he's asking him to take pity on him because of his dead cockroach, the proper diagnosis here is an appeal to pity. So appeal to pity or appeal to emotions in general is a very common fallacy. And again, the idea here is fallacies are mistakes of reasoning. So it's only a fallacy when you appeal to pity to get someone to accept your conclusion, which in this case is don't give me a ticket, right? So because appealing to pity is not a good reason for giving someone a ticket or not, it's fallacious reasoning. All right, number 5, either the economy should be completely free and unregulated, or we should have central planning and government control over every aspect of the economy. But the latter would be intolerable, so the economy should be free and unregulated. Now, a key thing to notice in this passage is this either or premise, right? Either this or that, okay? Because when you give someone 2 options, that's usually called a dilemma, right? So when you're faced with a dilemma, it means you have 2 options available to you, and either they're both bad or maybe they're both good, right? So a dilemma is a situation where you're having a hard time choosing between 2 options, right? So an either or sentence often gives or presents a dilemma. Now the problem with this is that, as you can probably see if you read the first sentence, those are not the only 2 possibilities, right? Complete free and unregulated economy and complete government control over the economy are not the only 2 choices. In fact, we have a very mixed economy in the United States. It's free in some ways, but also regulated and controlled by the government in other ways. So when that's the case, when the argument is presented as if there's only 2 choices or 2 options, but really there's more options, the fallacy is called false dilemma, because there's not really only 2 options, right? So the key to recognizing false dilemma is seeing that somebody is posing the situation as if there are only 2 choices, when really there are more than just 2 choices. All right, so 5 is false dilemma. 6, each individual part of my car weighs less than 20 pounds, therefore my car weighs less than 20 pounds. Now, this is one of those fallacies. There's 2 very closely related fallacies called the fallacy of composition and the fallacy of division, right? And the basic idea behind these fallacies, or what's wrong with the reasoning in these fallacies is that you assume that what's true of the parts is also true of the whole, or vice versa, that what's true of the whole is also true of the parts. So in this case, it's assuming what's true of the parts, right? The individual parts of my car weigh less than 20, so therefore the whole, my car as a whole, weighs less than 20. That one's called the fallacy of composition. So composition says is when you go from an assumption about the parts to a conclusion about the whole, right? And division is the other way around. Let's see if we can find a division here, right? So number 7 is actually division, right? So teenagers earn less on average than people in their 30s. Rita is 19, Joe is 35, therefore Joe earns more than Rita, right? So teenagers as a whole, right, on average, right, earn less than people in their 30s, so therefore Rita earns less than Joe, right? So this one goes from a premise about the whole to a conclusion about the parts, so that's the fallacy of division. All right, 8, Rita's a meter maid. Rita is lovely. Probably all meter maids are lovely. All right, so this should look familiar. It goes from premises about one person to a conclusion about a whole group of people, right? That's, as we talked about, number 1, I think it was. We're making a hasty generalization. We're generalizing about the whole group from a sample of just one. The example is from a Beatles song. I hope some of you recognized it. It's a very good song. If you've never heard it, go listen to it. If I was more tech savvy, I would paste a clip right into this recording. All right, number 9. In 1965, the average age of the members of the Beatles was 23. Therefore, the Beatles were formed in 1942. So in other words, this goes from a premise about the band members or the parts of the band to a conclusion about the band itself, right? So the band members' average age was 23, so therefore the band itself must be 23 years old. So again, from parts to whole is called the fallacy of composition. And number 10, I'm almost out of time. Senator Jones says the threat of terrorism has diminished, but how can you believe what he says? He's been divorced 5 times. Sheesh. So remember, when you attack the person or the character of the person making the argument instead of attacking the argument, that's called an ad hominem fallacy. So if you say that Senator Jones must be wrong because his character is bad in some way, that's the ad hominem fallacy. Now, just one quick point about these fallacies that I made in class, but that's important to remember, is that, remember, all fallacies are contextual. All right? And all that means is that there are some examples or contexts where it might be appropriate to attack someone's character and not fallacious, right? So if I am a politician and my opponent says, I have the greatest character in the world, I'm such a good person, so therefore you should vote for me, and it turns out that person doesn't really have a good character, then attacking his character is completely appropriate and reasonable, right? So it's only when you attack a person who's making an argument that's not related to his character, his or her character, where this becomes fallacious or an example of bad reasoning. All right, so just remember that all fallacies are contextual, meaning that there might be some contexts in which it's not irrational to attack someone's character or to go from parts to whole, etc. All right, I'll be back with a video where I work through exercises 8.4 and 8.5 very soon.